Welcome to the Religion Lecture for the Intro to the Creative Arts class. My name is Ken Steinbach. I'm one of the visual arts instructors of the course, and today we are going to be looking at a number of religious traditions as well as a number of artistic approaches and discussing some artworks that have a compelling connection to religion, have a very... We are going to start our conversation today looking at some artworks that are very old, and it does sort of bring us to a reality right away in that, for most of human history, art and ideas about religion or art and religious expression really were, kind of the same. For our 21st century, perhaps a Protestant perspective, a lot of Bethel students are from that tradition. The world of art and the world of religion are actually quite separated. They're distinct. There's not a lot of overlap between those two. And when we look in the span of human history and across culture, we find that this is actually unusual. And so for us in this context to look back at that, we need to kind of readjust our lenses, so to speak, and to remind ourselves that this is not the case. Some of the artworks we're going to start looking at today are as much as 30,000 years old. And, even back at that point, at that time in history, art and religion were really, kind of unified. At points, they were even the same thing. And that's a rich tradition, but it's one that maybe we need to adjust our lenses a little bit as we try to understand and get in the mind and see what the makers were about and see how those objects functioned in those spaces and those places functioned within the society relative to both art and religion. The objects that we're looking at here are two what are called Venus figures. And the names of the Venus figures are a name that would have been applied to these objects after they were discovered. So the archaeologists who pulled these up, and discovered these were both sort of found in sort of the area of Germany, France, in Europe. Over the last 100 years or so, they have, a number of these Paleolithic objects, small handheld objects. You can see the one on the top, the Venus of Willendorf, being sort of held in the hand, small votive objects that would have, been sort of carried around with an individual. So, but they were given this name, sort of Venus figure, after the fact because honestly, we don't, archaeologists really have no idea, how these things functioned. We don't know if they represent specific deities, if they represent specific individuals. Generally, however, the consensus is that these figures represent a certain kind of ideal. And that may be a little curious to us because of the very exaggerated features on some of them, especially the one on the Holzfeld below. But generally the thinking about how these function or how these sort of played out or were used within the culture at that time, if we take ourselves back to perhaps a more nomadic culture, or perhaps a more tribal culture, what does prosperity look like? What does success within a community look like? And that would be, a situation when there's an abundance of food and longevity. People are living a long time and sort of getting very robust in their physicality because there's an abundance and there's surplus. And so these figures are held up as standards of ideals, even standards of beauty within that culture because of what they represent, this idea of prosperity and health and wealth and so on. From a sculptural point of view, they're also just really sort of gorgeous objects. If we think about the Venus of Willendorf, for example, the very sort of wonderful carving on this and very expressive. It feels very modernist in the way that you can kind of look at that. That's the way that you can sort of understand it and see that. Likewise, there are some other prehistoric works that are particularly noteworthy. Some of the cave paintings you may have heard about. This one from Lascaux. There's another cave called Chauvet, which also has some terrific drawings in it. These large, this particular rendering of a horse is quite typical of what's happening there. And by the way, this drawing itself here is probably about life size. So these are not small drawings that are 12 inches. These are like very large, and they also kind of match the terrain of the cave wall itself. So like the swelling of the belly in this particular drawing is actually drawn on sort of a bulge in the cave wall. And so these cave renderings generally regarded that hunters would have gone in here. There were part of ceremonial, qualities where they would go in. They would sort of make these drawings as part of either an act of devotion, of act of veneration, act perhaps of supplication. Please let me get food for food for the table tonight. In any case, we may not know precisely how they function, but certainly we can sort of appreciate the really elegant. I mean, just look at the clarity of the line of that charcoal line, and the hooves of this creature, and the belly line down below, and the mane of the head. Holy smokes, that's such a gorgeous object. It just feels super contemporary, and that's one of the things that sort of wonder how many objects like this have been lost over time. But it's really sort of wonderful in its appreciation and expression of this creature. Another set of bison that are drawn here, again drawn about life size. Really a beautiful, wonderful rendering of with the ochre here, just really great silhouettes and just a wonderful set of drawings. Other things that would have occurred alongside of these kinds of drawings would be, sometimes they're abstract marks being made, marks just for their own sake, and there also were frequently marks that were made by hands. The artist would put their hand on the wall and then spit the ochre over their hand to create a negative shape of their hand on the wall. So in a way that there were also like qualities of self-portrait that were present in these. And of course, the caves are sites, so they are like actual locations. These are not just sort of random objects like the Venus figures, but these are locations that you would go into. And so we're finding, way back at this point in history, people are creating holy sites or sites of pilgrimage. And of course, when you get into Stonehenge, which we're looking at here, we can see these sarsen stones, which are very tall. It's like 15, 20 feet tall, weighing many, many tons, that are also being constructed in a form of architecture to capture spiritual ideas. Recent, archaeological evidence over the last 20, 30 years have just expanded. Like there are sites like this all over England, which was where Stonehenge is. There are sites like this all over England where stones or logs or landscape or different situations are created to orient to the summer and winter solstice. And these are sites that would have been, where there would have been a lot of ceremonies taking place. Kind of jump ahead a little bit and start looking at the Christian tradition, specifically the way that the early church was relating their artwork, or sort of dealing with artwork, making artwork that was distinctively different from the culture that was around it. The Christians came along, they took great pains actually to separate themselves from the religious traditions that they were surrounded with. And so their art, and specifically their architecture, they wanted that to reflect that difference. Here's an example of some of the architecture, the religious architecture that the early church would have been surrounded by. This is the Parthenon, which is a temple to the goddess Athena in Athens. And you can see that, there's a few little details, some sculptures that would have been present that would have been sort of placed up on the top of the pediments up there. But this would have been placed on a hill, certainly the highest, bit of architecture, the highest, piece of landscape in the city, and the Parthenon. Everyone, would have looked up to this, literally sort of looked up to this temple. This is a view of a recreation of the interior of the temple, what it would have looked like in that time. One of the very curious things that has happened to all that Greek and Roman sculpture, in that time and place about the time of Christ, was that virtually all of that was painted, which is something that we don't really think about when we see those works in museums now. When we see them in reproductions, all of that paint is long gone, eroded off and whatnot. And so we tend to sort of regard that stuff as always being sort of this sort of beautiful white marble because it's so pristine and lovely. We just like that. But in that time and place, this is actually, what these would have looked like. So the sculpture, which would have been marble, would have been painted very bright colors like this. And this is even a little bit subdued. A lot of the other sculptures that would have been around the city, around, the nation, would have been sort of like really intense blues, really intense reds, and which seems kind of jarring to our eyes, but that's how they looked at them at that point. In any case, the goal of this architecture, the goal of this structure, and these sculptures themselves were to sort of depict the goddess, depict the gods, create a holy space for them in which sacrifices would have been offered, in which a person could come sort of meet these figures in their work. And so the early Christian church, they wanted to create structures to have meetings, but they really didn't want this kind of thing, because they didn't want to turn Christ into the relationship with Christ into this kind of relationship that the surrounding culture had with this deity, with Athena like this. They wanted something that was very different.
So where did they look to find a kind of a meeting space that would fit their needs, that would not sort of infer things about the faith, because of the architecture, or the architecture was not sort of shaping the faith? And so what they did was they looked to the Roman basilica, which is basically just a meeting hall, just like more of a civic structure, outside the world of religion. And there are certainly parallels today. There's a lot of churches around that, will find, an old Target store and, grab that thing and turn it into a meeting place, set up some chairs and you're good to go. And that's pretty much kind of the strategy that they had here. Was that they were wanting to focus much more on the community. They wanted a break from the past. And so this was a structure that was available that would hold the number of people, the amount of people, in the way that they wanted, that to happen. And so they adopted this, and this kind of became, the standard, or just, the way that what early Christian churches look like. Of course, this was, after persecution a little bit more when that was let up, but this was one of the things that actually the earliest Christian structures that were built by Christians look like this.
So what you're looking at here then, after that Roman meeting hall, starts to become the standard for a while. Pretty soon they begin to make these structures out of stone, masonry, and they become more ornate themselves. And so they tend to have the material intensity of some of the other structures around them, but with this other kind of shape in mind, with this other kind of structure, this Roman meeting hall, this basilica form. That's what that was called. And you can see this from a structure. Apologies, I don't remember which structure this is, but it's a pretty typical example of this kind of early church architecture. And if we put the basilica architecture underneath it, you can see the really strong similarities between the two. So the Christians, they just entirely reinvented, they took this form, they reinvented it, and they reestablished it into a Christian church. Another thing that starts to play out in the history of the Christian church, art in the history of the Christian church, is that there are, of course, three different branches of Christianity that have developed. We have the early Catholic Church, which goes back literally to the time of St. Peter. We'll talk about that in a second. And that church continues as a single entity until 1054, in which there is an Orthodox split. The Orthodox, the Eastern Church, which we'll look at in a few minutes as well. That is established, and then in 1517 Martin Luther comes along, and suddenly we have Protestantism. And so now we have three different approaches within Christianity, and what we're going to do next is look at some specific works that are from each of these specific traditions. What we're looking at here is sort of the prototypical, or the first example, or the biggest, or the strongest example of Catholic art, which is actually the interior of St. Peter's in Rome. And St. Peter's is the Vatican. That's where the Pope is. That's the center of the Catholic Church. And what we're looking at right here, this is not actually a photo. This is a painting that was made by George Cook, sort of 1850s or so. Cook went in and made a painting of the interior of the church. It's actually a little nicer to see it this way, because it has been sort of added on to and changed somewhat more in a more contemporary context. So it's difficult to see that Roman basilica kind of structure in this church, but here you can see it very clearly. This is the center of the church, St. Peter's, as it currently, exists in Rome. And you can see that they've added this large structure in the center of the church, up at the front of the altar. To really understand how art is used in the Catholic Church, it's helpful to kind of understand two symbols that are happening here. One is that underneath the structure, within this structure, that's where the sacraments are held. In the Catholic tradition, the wine and the cup literally are the body and blood of Christ, not figuratively, not metaphorically, but there's a literalness there. And which would suggest that if you have Christ who is literally sort of present in the space, you build a structure that looks like this. You build a structure of holiness. With the great investment of materials, there's a lot of material wealth here. There's a lot of, sort of fabrication, and the symbolism is layered and layered and layered and layered. And the other thing that's kind of happening here, this is called St. Peter's because it is literally built upon the tomb of St. Peter. When St. Peter was an apostle, he came to this part of the world where he was martyred. And yet his tomb was sort of here, and they built this church literally upon the tomb of St. Peter. And there's a lot of archaeological evidence to back this up. And so the structure that you are looking at right here sits directly over the tomb of the man himself. And to the point that the Catholic tradition, St. Peter is considered the first pope. And so in this tradition, you have a literalness, Christ literally coming to earth in this physical way, and there's a great relevance and a great respect for how that can play out. Like the physicality of Christ is very real and present, as well as this tradition that goes back literally to the time of Peter. One of the major artworks from the Catholic tradition over the last 500 years is this one right here. It's called the Eisenheim Altarpiece by Matthias Grunewald. And it's a crucifixion on the outside. We'll talk about the structure in just a second. But this was a object of devotion. These altar pieces were very common at the time. They would have been in the center of the churches, the front of the churches, and they would have been to remind people of Christ, give visual representation to that. They were not meant to be objects of worship. They were meant to be sort of reminders and objects of veneration, which is a little different. So, but this structure right here was created to be placed in a hospital of a monastery. And so the monastery was actually sort of a healing. It had a mission of, a strong mission of being a place where people that had skin diseases and other sort of, things like leprosy, other nasty diseases like that, would go and to be healed. And that's really important as we kind of look at this thing, because if you look at this structure right here, the crucifix, which is on the outside, there are actually 3 different layers to this piece, but the crucifix that is on the outside, as we look ahead, we notice something really curious about the Christ figure. And as we see the Christ figure here, the way that Grunewald has painted this Christ figure, this is a Christ that is in deep anguish. This is not, one of the more sedate Christs that you find from time to time. This is a Christ who is clearly suffering, and specifically Christ who is suffering from wounds that would have been similar to the people who had been treated at this hospital, which were again, a hospital that tended to specialize in things like leprosy and skin disease and other things like that. So as the worshipers were in that space and they were looking here, they would find kinship with this figure. They would find, sympathy, a God who could understand, a God who could sympathize, a God that they could pray to, that they feel would understand what they were personally going through. Because remember, this is the Middle Ages. This is before, not only like Tylenol, but like robust things like morphine. It's like those things were largely not really available. You can see on the bottom right here, I've included an image of the outside of this because this is kind of curious, because these altar pieces frequently had these paintings on hinges. And so on the bottom right, you're seeing the outside of this. This is actually an interior state here where you open it up, and this is the vision on the inside. And so this is very different as well. And by the way, this would have been opened like on certain feast days. Generally the panels were closed, but they would open it up for services and then special situations. But what you're seeing then in the second state is another vision, but this one is a much more hopeful one. We have the Annunciation on the left, which is pretty typical. This is Mary sort of being told, you're going to have this child and whatnot. And then on the far right, you have this panel of resurrection. And so again, this would have been an object that would have been created specifically to offer hope, to offer a vision of redemption, and physical redemption, not just spiritual redemption, but physical redemption to these people that were in quite considerable pain as they were looking at these things. They were looking at the altarpiece. and this would be the innermost. This is the third way. So you open up the second set of wings that are inside, and this is what you see on the very inside of this. And again, this would have been revealed just at certain points, certain services throughout the year. And what you're looking at here is actually a couple of scenes from the temptation of St. Anthony. And St. Anthony, you can see him being tempted by demons on the far right, and also, having a conversation over on the left. But these would have been not only a figure to be sympathetic to your own suffering, but somebody besides Christ who would be, somebody who could walk alongside you in your difficulties. And this is a view of the center panel of Christ's resurrection. And it's just such a beautiful painting. It's just like exuberantly painted. I love the way he's kind of bursting out here to the shock, and the Roman soldiers just like completely falling over themselves, to get out of the way here, just out of surprise. And Christ is so redemptive, glow, in this sort of holy light. And again, this would have been a vision that Grunewald would have painted specifically to offer hope, to individuals who probably were at very difficult points in their lives. And another close-up of the temptation of St. Anthony. As I mentioned before, the church was unified until 1054, in which case, at which time the Orthodox Church, split off. They were largely moved towards the eastern part of the world, into Asia and Ukraine and Russia and those areas. So we have less familiarity, perhaps, with that tradition. What we're looking at here are from the Orthodox tradition, a couple paintings from the Orthodox tradition. Don't really have time to be delving into the architecture or some of the underlying ideas within that tradition, but these are some really noteworthy ideas that are represented here in these two objects. And these would have been icons. These are objects that were painted. They're typically smallish, maybe 2 feet high would be a very large icon, typically about 18 inches or so. And you notice there's one on the left here that's painted in the 13th century, and then there's one on the right, which would be a contemporary version of that, painted in the last 50 years. And they're, while not identical, they're virtually identical in terms of their content and what they're depicting and how it's being depicted. And that is by choice. In the Orthodox tradition, these icons are not meant to be reinvented. These are objects of veneration, and generally the way that these are regarded is that when these were developed back in the Byzantine era, which is roughly 1300 AD, like that time frame, like when these were developed, great care was put into this, and they arrived at forms of these icons that are actually seen as windows into holy spaces, perhaps even windows into heaven. And they were created, and it was kind of believed like they got it right. Like that's like they created these, and they were established, and they were developed by people that were really inspired by the Holy Spirit. And when you get it right, you just don't change it. Orthodox actually means right thinking, and so in that tradition, these are crafted in a way that respects that tradition and goes back and said, these are spaces into holy spaces, and holy things don't change. And so we keep these forms the same. And to the point where even, I have a good friend who's an Orthodox, who's a painter, who's also kind of works on Orthodox icons. He participates in that tradition as well. And what they say when they are making an Orthodox icon like this one on the right, you notice it doesn't say it was painted by this individual, Christian Hales. It says it was written by him. And that's how they describe that, because they want to make a distinctive difference. It's like they're not painting these, they're not making these up, they are just participating in this tradition that exists in a really specific way. And there's even like really specific ways that they in terms of the processes that they use. It's not just like, use these paints and copy this thing. It's like, no, you have to put this layer first, and then there's a bit of a meditation that you do to, as you are contemplating certain things, as you are putting on different layers of this. Well, they're very structured. And as I noted before, these are meant to be sort of windows into holy spaces, into another time and place. And for the Westerners like us, we tend to look into an artwork, even like the previous artworks that we were looking at in the Catholic tradition, and we look into those scenes. But in the Orthodox tradition, it's a two-way street. We look into, but also there is something within this space and this time that looks out at us as well. Another contemporary-ish version of an icon. And here we have the St. Mary's Orthodox Cathedral in Minneapolis. It's not a big space, but they're very welcoming. And so feel free if you wanted to go down there and participate in this. They would love to have you be there, and you can see, and you can look around, of course, and you can see that it feels very Byzantine. If you know anything about Byzantine architecture, the architecture is related to that. It's like everything is sort of taken from the Byzantine era, time and place, as a way of sort of honoring that sort of the right thinking that they believe was established at that time. And you can see the icons, up in the front. There's a lot of icons, and there's icons sort of all over this place that are meant to be objects of devotion. As I mentioned, the art in the Protestant tradition, the Protestant Reformation split off about 1517 or so, and one of the big distinctive, or one of the big ideas that was sort of present in that when Martin Luther, like the things that he was rejecting about the church at that time, was what he saw as an overuse of iconography, the iconography kind of getting in the way, the imagery kind of getting in the way. And so the Protestant tradition tended to do a lot of rejecting. They tend to, like, we don't want to do this, we don't want to do that. And really it's about the word, it's about the text, and it's about what the scripture says, and that's where we're going to center our theology. It's not going to be about this other physical things. It's not going to be about these other traditions. We're starting from scratch. However, makers got to make, painters got to paint, and there were plenty of Protestant artists, people who became Protestant at the Reformation, who were painters by trade and wanted to do this. It wasn't just a vocation, but it was a passion for them, and they had to figure out like what to do next, because they were not satisfied with just like, well, don't make anything. They wanted to participate in some kind of tradition. And so this is what we're looking at right here, this still life tradition. And this is very curious, because from our perspective looking back, we tend to see paintings of still life as being, just a bunch of fruit on a table, like whatever, it doesn't really matter. It's not really that big of a deal. It may be decorative, whatnot. But for these individuals at that time, and this was really prevalent in Spain. There was a lot of these vanitas paintings up north in the Netherlands and so on. There was a lot of like Dutch painters that were painting like this right here. And so if you look carefully at this image, what you are seeing is not only like really extraordinarily tight, highly crafted painting, of fruits and vegetables and fruits and objects, to be eaten, and really voluptuous flowers and like all of this. And this is a huge tradition. A lot of Protestants participated in this. But there are also kind of subtle things that are happening as well. And if you start to look closely, you will notice that some of the fruit starts to have a little bit of rot in it. There are like flies, that show up periodically. Occasionally you will see some of these where there's a skull that's present. And what these are about in terms of their artwork and how they relate to Protestant traditions these are object lessons. And so what the artist is telling us here, what's actually happening here, is that the artist is saying the world is a beautiful place. It is a wonderful place filled with many things that God has given us, fruits and opulence and like wealth and like all of this stuff. However, this is like all of this too will pass. And so don't be seduced by these things. And so they're very curious in this tension and the way that they, on the one hand, they celebrate all of this stuff, the forms and all of these things that are, like the voluptuousness, and, you just want to reach out and grab that peach and take a bite, right? But at the same time, then they also have these other elements like, yes, don't be seduced by these things. Don't let it take over your life. And so they're meant to be kind of morality lessons. Up until this point, I've been talking about art relative to its placement within a particular society or particular religion, particular group. And now we're actually going to shift gears a bit, and I'm going to be talking about specific artworks by specific individuals in which religion plays a role, religious imagery, iconography, and these are not going to be so tidily sort of connected to a group. They're much more, like a lot of contemporary art, it tends to be much more based on the directions and the goals and the aims of the individual, and they're coming from a lot of different perspectives. While these works that we are looking at are coming from a variety of different perspectives, all of them do relate to or embrace religious imagery or iconography in some way. And so I'll talk about that as we go. So the work that we're seeing right here is by a contemporary British artist named Mark Quinn. The piece is titled Eternal Spring. And this piece was made probably 20 years ago, 15 years ago anyway. And so were you to go see this one today, and by the way, sorry I spoke a little quickly, what you're looking at here is a container that holds fresh flowers, fresh sunflowers. So these are not synthetic flowers. These are like real, actual, at one point living flowers that are right here. If you were to go see this piece today, being 20 years later, this piece will look precisely the same. Mark Quinn immersed all of these, created a structure, went through a lot of technology, did a lot of different things, and let's see, I have it written down here. What did he put this? It's like a silicone gel or something silicone gel that he immersed these into. And so these are actually kind of suspended in this silicone gel, and they will never decay, more or less. Eventually, sometime they probably will. But what Mark Quinn has done here is he is sort of playing around with the notion of the still life, and where you will see in the previous ones by Mignon and other artists, of the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, they're all about this decay. Mark Quinn is talking about a contemporary perspective, an era of perhaps superficiality and plastic surgery and happy smiles everyone, all of this in which decay is sort of interrupted, or that death is kind of artificially interrupted. And so you have these living things which are literally not allowed to sort of pass. And what's really sort of, it's a funny piece in a way. It's also kind of poignant. You kind of feel bad for these flowers that were never meant to, return back to a natural state and just, return back into dust. And so there's some wit and there's some humor about this. But what he's really talking about is a contemporary approach to, beauty and fashion, or beauty and these ideas, these eternal ideas. There's also a video by Sam Taylor Wood that deals with this, within the still life tradition as well. And if you wanted to, this would actually be, take a little break right now. This would be a good time to just stop and find a link to this on the ICA website and watch this video. It's about 5 minutes long. Sam Taylor Wood is a filmmaker, and she applied her skills to this idea, this notion of sort of decay and still life, and sort of capturing the brevity of life by just setting the fruits up and filming them, over the span of, a month or two probably, as they go through this natural, cycle of sort of rotting and decay. And what's really, it's an interesting back and forth between Mark Quinn and Sam Taylor Wood in these pieces, because where Quinn is, his stuff is just sort of freakishly weird in the way that it doesn't decay, and Sam Taylor Wood's is sort of elegantly beautiful in the way that it does decay. And I love the way that the two artists are kind of a back and forth conversation about that. In any case, Sam Taylor Wood absolutely participating in this tradition of still life. Another contemporary work, I think that all of us have had this, this artwork in the basement of their churches, right, growing up, so, stuck away in the kitchen somewhere. This is a painting by a guy named Werner Salman, and it's interesting whenever I talk about this piece in a class. It's like I show this up and everybody kind of responds to it, because we've all had this image, and as I've noted, people that go to Bethel tend to be Protestant and evangelical and Midwestern, and we don't have like a very deep or rich visual tradition. And that's not a shot, and that's not a huge criticism. It's just like our spirituality has tended to exclude that. and there's historical roots for that. I think it's a little bit too severe myself. I think we don't need to be quite so uptight about that. But in any case, this is one of the few images that kind of snuck in the back door for many of us, and we kind of had this, or people that we respected, or churches, whatever, had this. And this is, contemporary artists who have a Christian faith have a very complicated relationship with this object, because Werner Sallman, he painted this, but, this is not what the man looked like. It was, Christ did not look like this. He was not European, and so there have been a lot of artists who have kind of taken this and painted their own versions of this. There's a really great one out there where somebody painted virtually identical, except they gave him blue eyes, which is even a little stranger and odder. But it's a point of conversation. And on the one hand, it's like, yeah, people, I think, the popularity of this among evangelicals is a suggestion to me. It's like we crave these kinds of images. We crave images that give us visual reminders. Like, we're such a visual, humans are visual, right? And, having those things are important to us. And yet our theology says, well, let's not let that stuff get in the way. It's like, I think we're at kind of at cross purposes internally at some points. So. In any case, we'll take a look next at one artwork that also kind of reinvents this. This is Cliff Davis made this piece, 1993. His version of this, that was, sort of at the beginning, you could say, of the religious right movement, sort of after, Reagan was really the beginning of that, but sort of the early time of the rise of the religious right and the moral majority and those kinds of things. And Cliff Davis actually used the opportunity to kind of reinvent the Werner Sallman head of Christ, called the conformist, which is, where Christ, even in the Werner Sallman, is a bit of an outsider. He's somebody who's speaking, truth to power and whatnot, or he's certainly speaking truth to us. In this one right here, he's Mr. Corporate America. He's got the little American flag pin, and he's got the sort of the nice haircut, and he may be sort of more appropriately look like somebody who's Palestinian in terms of its coloration, but he still is really Mr. Corporation, and Cliff Davis in this piece is kind of talking about that, the wedding of establishment with Christianity, and he's asking us a question, and there's some critique here about his perspective and what he kind of sees as going on and what he thinks ought to be going on relative to those two. So this piece doesn't exist as an affirmation the way that the Werner Sallman, or it doesn't try to give us a vision of what he thought Christ was like. It's kind of a probing question, actually kind of a provocative question about, is this right? Another altarpiece here painted by Jan van Eyck in the later part of the 1400s. And this becomes the basis for another work by a contemporary artist, Chris Martin. So in particular, I just want to use this piece as a kind of a reference. I want you to pay particular attention to the silhouette of this, the shape of the altarpiece, particularly on the top, before we jump ahead to the next piece. Chris Martin's work, he's a Belgian artist. His work often uses or reinvents the work from the Christian tradition, iconography, images, symbols, and so on from the European Christian tradition, kind of reinvents it, reinterprets it, sometimes as a way to critique historical Christianity or the, sort of the ideas within Christianity, other times to just deal with conversations in the larger culture. And so we can see this one right here. He has taken, the silhouette and created basically a pretty precise reproduction of the altarpiece that we previously saw, only has obviously removed all the panels, removed all the imagery and all of the content, and we just are left with this really sort of gorgeous and lovely structure then that he takes around. He's installed this in a number of places. I've never seen this one in person, but I've seen versions of it installed against a seascape once, against a forest another time. And it's a compelling question, I think, to ask, like, what happens here when that is removed and we begin to look at the natural world through this lens? When you start to look at the natural world through this, what kind of ideas is he talking about? And I think one idea that becomes very clear is that in titling the piece "Altar," he is, there may be a play on the word altar, as in to change something, but he is also wanting us to reflect back to nature. He is wanting us to perhaps think about conversations about how we might look at the natural world in terms of these same things, how we might sort of regard our environment with the same reverence or the same sense of speaking, that we might find in this other kind of conversation of the altarpiece. Another work by Chris Martin is this structure right here, which is called "For Whom," and this piece is down at the Walker Sculpture Garden. And not only is the Minneapolis Institute of Art free all the time, but the Walker Sculpture Garden, once it warms up, is again an excellent place to spend an afternoon with somebody. It's also free. You can walk around, you can see a number of artworks, and then along the way you can see this piece by Chris Martin, which is called "For Whom." To describe this artwork a little bit, it's substantially large. Like if you were standing underneath that, you would have to reach up. The photograph is a tiny bit deceptive. If you were reaching up, you would have to reach up to touch that bell. That's how tall it would be. It's probably a 12 or 14 foot tall structure, and that bell is large. It's got a great diameter on it. So this is not like a tiny thing that's on a sidewalk here. And a curious thing about this artwork is that it was a bell that was cast for a church. However, the bell does not have a clapper in it, which means that it doesn't make any sound. It's also what's called a kinetic piece, which means that it moves. And so when I have been down there, if you wait around a while, I think it's like on the hour and on the quarter hour also, that this thing will actually start swinging as if it was a bell in a church that was literally, sort of marking the time in the hours as churches like that do for, have done for many, many years. So, but as you stand there and you look at this thing, it is completely silent. And the bell is swinging, the bell is tolling, but there is nothing that is happening. And again, as we remember, Chris Martin's work a little bit, kind of reinventing imagery, Christian imagery, recontextualizing it, or sort of taking some of those symbols or objects or ideas and putting them into a new light to talk about other things. This starts to get pretty interesting. So the title is "For Whom." And so I'll move to the next slide, and I'll talk a little bit about the reference for the title of this piece. The title refers to this poem by John Donne. And John Donne, you can see the date for this here. He was a metaphysical poet, who was a poet who kind of deals a lot with bigger questions, heaven and hell and spirituality and embodiment and things like that. He's also an individual that went through a pretty dramatic conversion in his life. The poetry is sort of wonderful in the way that it kind of spans the range from young and adolescent and in pursuit of all those things that young men would be in pursuit of, and then as he gets older, he starts to take on the more serious issues, the more serious ideas in his artwork. And so one of his more famous poems, "No Man is an Island," there's a bit of it right here. "No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. Any man's death diminishes me because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never send me to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee." And so what Dunn is talking about here is our connectedness to other people. When the bell tolls, there's a part of, the bell, the church bell is what he's talking about. When a church bell would toll, it would mark somebody's funeral, the passing of someone. And so what Dunn is saying in this poem, it's like whenever that bell tolls, it's not just for that person, it tolls for all of us in some way. We're all connected. And what Chris Martin in this artwork here is he's completely subverting that, and he is giving us a bell that tolls, but it doesn't make any sound. And so in Chris Martin's piece, to me, this piece has always kind of felt, has a twinge of existential despair. It's like, for whom the bell tolls, the bell doesn't tolling for anybody because there's no ultimate purpose. It's kind of what he's seeming to say with parts of this. And it's a very lonely piece. You stand out there, and this thing is just going, and it's a very mournful and kind of a lonely and despairing piece. And I think that I think we need to be careful not to cast easy solutions at Chris Martin, or to, judge quickly and say, well, if only, Chris Martin were to be this way or believe what I believe, then his problems would go away. Because I think, John Donne would not have that view. John Donne, his older writings are filled with moments of, anguish. Even after, he acquired a faith and developed a faith that sustained him, he still had those moments. And so I think Chris Martin is not necessarily speaking, absolutely, but I think I think that we can understand that work in a variety of contexts, and we need to be careful not to just assume that we have any answers, and if only Martin believed like we did, then he would not feel, this piece would not be so isolating and alone and separating. British artist we're looking at right here, one of my favorites. I've followed the work of Anthony Gormley for quite a long time. Gormley was commissioned to make a large piece out on the British landscape, and was invited by a council. This is north of London, quite a ways. And he went out and he viewed the site, was initially not very interested in this commission, but then once he saw the site and talked to a few people, he became excited about it. Again, it's really important to sort of understand the scale of this piece. Gormley is an individual who makes works almost entirely about the physicality of his own body. He doesn't do this because he is self-centered. This is not like an ego thing. What he's doing is he is just using his body as a way of talking about a lot of things. And he just, sometimes for artists, it's like, well, I always have myself with me, so I can, use myself as a way of, as a model for what I'm making. So the proportions for this piece are from Gormley, but the size clearly is not, because it's about 66 feet tall. It's very large. It also has a wingspan of about 180 feet or so it's quite large. It's actually larger wingspan than a 747. And Gormley, designed this piece as kind of a memorial. It's not necessarily a direct memorial. Sometimes there are memorials that we put out into the world, in which it's about a specific individual and a specific sort of loss of life or something like that. But Gormley, his initial attraction for the site was a curious one, because he went out and he realized that the site itself was actually the location of coal mining. So there was a lot of coal mining that was done. The mound that was created was actually piled up as a result of this coal mining, and he became kind of fascinated with that. Remember earlier in the discussion here, we were talking about sort of the English, landmarks like Stonehenge and structures like that. Well, some of the structures that are prehistoric structures that dot that part of the country are actually these earthworks where cultures would spend countless hours sort of stacking up Silbury Hill and other places, these giant mounds of soil as a way of shaping the landscape to respond to like I said earlier, they were often sort of related to summer winter solstice, things like that. But these artificial mounds, these mounds that were created by humans for these purposes, and Gormley went to this site and was intrigued by that. That this was also a kind of a site that was created. This was a kind of a location that was made by humans. It was not a natural location. As they sort of removed the coal from one part of the hill, they piled it up on this other one. And so he made this object that was kind of a testament to that, or memorial to that, or speaking into that conversation about all of this coal that had been removed, this artificiality. And the piece itself is made out of steel, and so it sits there on the landscape, and it is a testament to not necessarily individuals, but just this action. There's kinship with some of the previous pieces, the prehistoric pieces that were made by peoples that we don't know, as the landscape has also been shaped in a contemporary context. It's another view of the same piece, and you can see this is even a little bit exaggerated because of the lens, but if it's 66 feet tall, that would be 10 times taller than, or 11 or 12 times taller than any of the people that are there. But kind of gives you a sense of the materiality, the physicality of it, but not necessarily. I guess what I'm saying is actually larger than what it seems in the photos. The final artwork we're going to look at today is another piece that's down at this Walker Sculpture Garden. And so now, after this, I will have given you 2 artworks, so that when you go down there, when you take a friend down there, maybe somebody that you're interested in, and you want to hang out with them, you can pretend to be very smart as you talk about the Chris Martin piece, and then you can wander over to this James Turrell, because this is a great little place to hang out and have a conversation. This is actually a structure that is it's up by the building at the Walker. So you have to walk up, and you walk down into the landscape, because this is a structure that's subterranean. So to physically describe this, you walk down into this space. It's like maybe 16, 18 feet square on the inside, and these are benches around the outside that you can sit on. Excuse me. And then you can look up and you can see through that. And what you're seeing at the top here is not a television screen, it's not paint, it's not anything else. You're actually looking out directly into the sky. And so the way that this piece works is that James Turrell, who is the artist, has done some really subtle things here, and that the light in the space, you notice that there are some fluorescent lights around the seats, or some lights, not fluorescents, but some lights around the seats. He has calibrated those to adjust, so that when you look up through the sky, the lights subtly adjust. You don't even notice that it's happening, but they adjust to the light that's coming in. And so when you look up, the sky just appears almost entirely flat. It's completely impossible to describe, but it's almost like you're looking at a TV screen when you look up at that sky, and it's so wonderful, especially when clouds are going past, or if it's snowing a little bit maybe and stuff is coming down. And by the way, this is heated, so you can be in there in the winter and get nice and toasty warm. And the title of the work is called Sky Pesher. A pesher is a word that we're probably not familiar with. I had to look it up, for this talk. It's a Hebrew word that means interpretation, and it's a word that's specifically related to the idea of scriptural fulfillment. It's like something that was foretold to come to pass, and then it is coming to pass. And so as you look up here, part of the thing about this piece is that Turrell is just giving you a delightful visual experience as you look up at the sky. But also another thing that's happening here is he is wanting to actually bring the sky down to you. He's wanting to sort of flatten that distance. And this is sort of a curious idea. And to understand Terrell's work in this piece in particular, and by the way, he's done a number of these kinds of installations. They don't all have the name Sky Pesher, but he's done like 100 of these all over the world. I've seen probably half a dozen in my life, and they all kind of have the same structure where you go in and then you look up at the sky, and then the sky is, the light is adjusted against the sky to really kind of frame the sky, so you see the sky is in a very different way. It recontextualizes that. So to understand what's kind of happening here, we need to look at one of Terrell's first pieces. This is a work called Sky Space Meeting House by James Terrell. And a lot of the Sky Space pieces or installations or artworks that you are seeing relate to this one and the ideas that are sort of present right here. So some context is helpful here. And again, what you're looking at is a meeting space, but the hole in the ceiling is actually like sky. What you're looking at must be night out there or close to night, because it's a night sky that you're looking at right here. So maybe pragmatic question. People always ask, like, well, what do they do about the rain that comes in? It's like, I don't know. I suppose they have, maybe there's a structure that covers it when they're not using it, whatever. But it is just literally open to the sky when they are there. But the Sky Space Meeting House is actually a Quaker space. It's a meeting house for Quakers, and I think that's important to understand what's happening here, because this is a meeting structure. And so if we're looking at religious architecture, specifically Christian architecture, in the Quaker tradition, if you're looking at this thing, the space right here, which is a pretty typical Quaker space. I've been to a Quaker service before. What do you notice? And that is that there's really not like a center. There's not a front. If you will look around, you notice that all of the pews kind of face each other. It's a little difficult to see right here, but basically the pews are all around the outside and they face towards each other. And I will tell you my own experience of going to a Quaker service at one point, and that is, they say, well, the service starts at like 11 o'clock or whatever, and I got there, my wife and I got there, and we kind of sat down, and nothing happened, and nothing happened, and then, we're kind of like, I'm looking at my watch, it's like, well, what's going on here? And, the place was filled, there were a lot of people there, but nobody was doing anything. And then after a while, what happened was somebody stood up, and they said, I would like to read a text. And so they read a piece of scripture. But then they sat down, and we just sat there for a long time. It seemed like a long time, probably 2-3 minutes. And then somebody else stood up, and they said, this is something that was on my heart this week. And then they spoke. And they kind of just, not a sermon. And this person, was not, the leader, didn't seem to be the leader, but they spoke for a few minutes about an idea. And then a few minutes later, somebody said, well, I'd like us to sing this song. And so then we all sort of sang a song, and it went on this way for like 90 minutes or so, and then eventually everybody just got up and left. And of course it made me crazy, because it's like, well, come on, let's get going, let's get organized. Where's the program? It's like I wanted all of this stuff to kind of happen on a schedule, but that's not that. In the Quaker spirituality, it's like all people are given access to God, and all people are allowed to present ideas to others. The authority, it's very egalitarian in that way. There's a great sense of equality. Anybody can participate, and the Holy Spirit moves to all people. And the hole in the sky is a metaphor about God coming down to all of those people. And it's a very beautiful metaphor. And of course, the Sky Pesher is about that. It's like what can be revealed. And so it has connections to, a piece like the Chris Martin piece, with the frame with the Ghent altar piece, sort of looking at nature. And to some degree, this is about looking at nature and finding spirituality, through that, through the sky. But it's also about this metaphor of God being present with us. That our experience with God does not need to be so tightly mediated, as it is in other places, but in this religion it is not, in this faith tradition it is not. So Well, that's the end of our lecture. Don't forget to watch that Sam Taylor Wood video. It's about 5 minutes long, which will put this entire lecture at about an hour or so, and then take the quiz after that. So, thanks. We'll see you.